So as I mentioned at the top, I'm not sure anyone in the public expected we were going to get new big deal factual revelations from the impeachment scandal today. But surprise, you can never get too comfortable with this story. It just keeps going.
Last Friday, a member of my staff told me of events that occurred on July 26th. While Ambassador Volker and I visited the front, this member of my staff accompanied Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Sondland met with Mr. Yermak. Following that meeting, in the presence of my staff at a restaurant, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump and told him of his meetings in Kyiv. The member of my staff could hear President Trump on the phone asking Ambassador Sondland about the investigations. Ambassador Sondland told President Trump the Ukrainians were ready to move forward. Following the call with President Trump, the member of my staff asked Ambassador Sondland what President Trump thought about Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland responded that President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden, which Giuliani was pressing for. At the time I gave my deposition on October 22nd, I was not aware of this information. I'm including it here for completeness.
This was not known before today's impeachment hearing. What Ambassador Bill Taylor just described there is something that happened the day after that phone call between President Trump and the Ukrainian president, which kicked off this whole impeachment saga. The day after that call, Gordon Sondland, the Trump inaugural donor and rookie diplomat, he called President Trump on his cell phone from a restaurant in Ukraine. Ding, 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 ding. Like red flag sirens going off in the counterintelligence world, just about that, right? He calls President Trump personally on his cell phone from a restaurant in Ukraine. And an embassy staffer who's with him in the restaurant in Ukraine overhears on that call President Trump asking Gordon Sondland about Ukraine doing these investigations that he wants. When Gordon Sondland hangs up that call with the president, the staffer who's sitting there with him turns to him and asks him, what does President Trump think about Ukraine? Sondland then reportedly tells the staffer, quote, President Trump cares more about the investigations of Biden. That was new today. The president personally, following up personally and directly with his guy in Ukraine about getting his Biden investigations. When Bill Taylor dropped that proverbial bomb today, he said this is new information. He said he had not known this when he gave his earlier deposition. And he said he asked his lawyer to notify the committee about this new information as soon as he learned of it last Friday. He also said that since his counsel notified the committee about this fact, this new fact that was not previously in the record, he said he believed the committee was following up on it. Well, indeed they are. Now we know.
Well, in terms of the new information that Ambassador Taylor gave today about this conversation, the day after President Trump is on the phone with President Zelensky, in which one of Ambassador Taylor's staff is overhearing a conversation between Sondland and the president, and the president is speaking loud enough where he can hear part of the conversation, and the president is interested in whether the Ukrainians are going to do the investigation, and Sondland assures him that they are. This is obviously very important because there is an effort apparently to, by the president's allies, throw Sondland under the bus, throw Mulvaney under the bus, throw anybody under the bus in an effort to protect the president. But what this call indicates, as other testimony has likewise indicated, is that the instructions are coming from the president on down. I think this witness is potentially very important. And of course, we are moving to depose this witness, and we have already scheduled their deposition.
New testimony, new revelation about the president's direct and personal involvement, new witness scheduled to give a deposition to the impeachment committees the day after tomorrow. That witness will be the staffer to Bill Taylor, who overheard that call. New stuff every day. Stay hydrated. Keep pace. This is going to get bigger before it gets smaller.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.